Thursday Nightmares channel.
Calvary Cemetery looked much darker at night. As we passed through the gate, the cold wind cut across my face, and the silence was almost suffocating. Marcos, Julia, and I had been planning this shoot for weeks. The YouTube channel was growing, and we needed something scarier, darker. But deep down, I knew going into a cemetery at night was a stupid idea. Still, there we were, with our cameras and microphones. What the hell were we doing? "Relax, Edu," Julia said with that defiant smile of hers while checking the microphone. "It's going to be fine. It's just another shoot." But something in the air was making me uneasy. The smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of dead flowers and the absolute darkness made everything feel suffocating. Calvary was huge, and even with the flashlight, I couldn't see where it ended. The wind that passed between the gravestones made strange sounds, like the wails of something we couldn't see. We started walking deeper into the cemetery. As we moved forward, the gravestones became older, covered in moss and cracks. The ground seemed wet, but it hadn't rained, which was really strange. My heart started racing for no apparent reason. That's when we saw a group of people. They were crouched near a mausoleum, wrapped in old blankets. "Shit, homeless people," Marcos whispered, glancing at Julia. "Let's film fast and get out of here before they notice us." Something about those people scared me. It wasn't just the poverty, it was something more, like they had lost something beyond their dignity. Julia signaled for us to take a side path away from the group. We moved further into a secluded corner between twisted trees. The sound of footsteps or any life seemed to have disappeared completely. We set up the equipment in silence, but my mind couldn't stop thinking about the people we saw. There was something very strange about that place. Something we shouldn't have ignored. "Calvary Cemetery," Marcos began, recording his introduction for the camera. He was talking about ghost legends and haunted souls, but my focus wasn't there. There was a smell. At first, I thought it was the vegetation, something rotting in the ground, but then it became stronger. Much stronger. A stench so intense it made my stomach turn. The smell of rotten meat and sulfur, so strong that my eyes watered. "Do you guys smell that?" I asked, interrupting Marcos. Julia stopped and looked around, confused. "Smell what?" The camera was still rolling, but at that moment, I knew the recording was doomed. "That smell, where's it coming from?" I muttered, holding my nose. It wasn't a dead animal. It wasn't anything natural. Marcos suggested we go investigate. I wanted to run, disappear from there, but I couldn't. We started following the smell, and the air around us seemed heavier, almost suffocating. The closer we got, the worse the smell became, like we were approaching something that had been dead for a long time. And that's when I saw it. On the ground, there was something moving in the darkness. The silence was absolute, but my heart pounded in my ears. Julia's flashlight caught a crouched figure, its skin hanging like rags from rotting bones. The smell coming from it was unbearable. It was a body, but it was moving. Its eyes were hollow, soulless. "Holy shit!" I screamed, instinctively stepping back. The thing, or whatever it was, stood up slowly, like its bones were breaking with every movement. I couldn't take my eyes off it as the air around us seemed to freeze. The sound of dead flesh dragging across the ground felt like a curse. This isn't possible," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. The zombie, there was no other word for it, staggered toward us, leaving a trail of decay. I wanted to run, but my feet were stuck to the ground, as if fear had sunk its claws into me. "Run!" Marcos shouted, but my body didn't respond. Julia grabbed my arm, and finally, my feet started moving. We ran between the gravestones, the sound of it following us was unbearable. I could feel the stench of death behind me, and every step was a battle against the absolute terror consuming me. When I looked back, I saw it wasn't alone. There were more. A lot more. The decomposed bodies emerged from the shadows, crawling with erratic movements, their mouths open in expressions of infinite hunger. They're coming, I murmured, almost in a trance. Julia was pulling me, but I couldn't take my eyes off those things. Each one looked worse than the last, pieces of flesh falling off, empty eyes, and exposed bones. The gate was in sight, but when we reached it, it was locked. "We're trapped," Marcos yelled, banging desperately on the rusted metal. The creatures were surrounding us, the smell of death and decay filling the air, choking any hope of escape. I felt bile rise in my throat. There was nowhere to run. We were trapped in the middle of a living nightmare. "Shit, we're gonna die here," Julia screamed. The desperation in her voice was palpable. I looked around, trying to find any way out. But all I saw were the zombies closing in, dragging their dead bodies across the ground. Reality was warping, time seemed to have stopped. The unbearable stench, the sound of bones scraping against the gravestones, this was the end. And there was nothing we could do. Despair rose inside me like an unstoppable tide. The locked gate in front of us felt like a death sentence, and the zombies, with their rotting presences and hollow eyes, were slowly closing in. We could hear the shuffle of their feet on the ground, the wet sound of decaying flesh scraping against the cemetery stones. The air, now thick with the unbearable smell of death, was so heavy it seemed difficult even to breathe. Julia was pounding on the gate with all her strength, as if that would miraculously open a path to our escape. But nothing happened. We were trapped there, surrounded by a horde of the dead that slowly cornered us. There was nowhere to go. Shit. Marcos started climbing the gate, his hands trembling and sweating. "Come on, hurry." He reached out to me, his eyes wide with pure fear. I wanted to react, but my muscles were paralyzed by fear. The creatures were only a few meters away, with their mouths open, darkened and broken teeth, as if their only purpose in existence was to devour us. Suddenly, I felt Julia pull me hard, screaming, "Climb, Edu! For God's sake!" My hands finally grabbed the cold, rusted metal of the gate, and I started climbing. The creatures were almost on top of us. When I looked down, I saw Marcos on the other side, pushing Julia up. She was still hanging, her legs kicking as the creatures advanced, trying to grab her. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it was going to explode. One of the creature's rotten hands grabbed Julia's leg. The scream she let out echoed through the cemetery, a sound I would never forget. The thing was pulling her down with unbelievable strength, its skeletal fingers digging into the flesh of her leg like claws. I reached out, trying to grab her. "Julia, hold on." The pain in her eyes was devastating, the fear consuming every expression on her face. When I finally managed to pull her to the top of the gate, the creature let out a grotesque growl, almost as if it were frustrated at losing its prey. Julia, now beside me, was panting, her leg injured, and blood stained her torn pants. The three of us finally jumped to the other side of the gate, landing on the ground with a dull thud. The relief was temporary. The creatures were still piling up on the other side of the gate, their deformed faces and gaping mouths as if they could still reach us. The sound of their bodies hitting the metal was grotesque, and even knowing we were out of reach, it brought no comfort. "We need to get out of here now," Marcos said, his voice trembling. Julia could barely stand. Blood was dripping from her leg, and she struggled to stay on her feet, leaning on me. Every step away from that hell felt like a fight against the very terror consuming us. We walked as fast as we could without looking back. The silence outside the cemetery was oppressive, as if the world out there had no idea of the horror we had witnessed. But even outside, the smell of death still seemed to cling to us. I could still feel the decay seeping into my skin, into the air I was breathing. And worst of all, I knew that experience would never leave us. We finally reached the car. We rushed in, locking all the doors. The silence inside the vehicle was as heavy as the air in the cemetery. No one said anything, our hearts still racing. Marcos started the engine with trembling hands, and we drove off as fast as we could, leaving Calvary Cemetery and its rotting horrors behind. Yet, even when we were finally safe, something didn't feel right. I looked at Julia, who was pale, sweating, and trembling in the back seat. Her eyes, which once carried a spark of defiance and courage, were now hollow, like the eyes of the creatures that hunted us. "Are you okay?" I asked, but my voice felt distant. She didn't respond. She just stared at me and then smiled. A macabre smile, devoid of any human warmth. Marcos looked back, noticing the same thing, and slammed on the brakes. "Julia, what the hell is that?" That's when we realized. She wasn't the same anymore.